Okay, thanks for having me. Mike asked that I do a presentation that involved the broader aspects of marine protected areas, not just the work that's been going on recently in the Plymouth area in the projects I've been involved in. So I'll try and do a little bit of an overview. And just to sort of go into what Mike suggested I do, I'm the Principal Specialist on MPAs. Marine protected areas are any part of the seas that are protected either by statutory or voluntary means for one feature or other for their conservation benefit. So it's a very broad brush what marine protected area means, from way up into our tidal estuary reaches all the way out to, I think the furthest marine protected area we have is way off of the continental, it's just off the continental shelf off of about 200 kilometers southwest of the Isles of Scilly. So we have this enormous range of areas where they're set up. So this talk is in collaboration with other funders. So Princess funded us to do some of the work in Plymouth area, both on the Eddystone Reef MPA and also in Cawsand. So, and I recognize that we subcontracted or worked with other partners like the Cornwall Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority and our Eddystone work, and the Ocean Conservation Trust, which is the charitable wing of the National Marine Aquarium in Plymouth. And the University of Exeter did the data analysis on the Eddystone work. So without collaboration, we're nothing in conservation. And it's wonderful to work with both statutory regulator bodies as well as NGOs and academics in this work. It makes the work richer. But let's start with MPAs themselves. There is a map of our entire UK MPA extent without actually the largest one in Europe, which is just off northwest Scotland. It's not on that chart yet. But anyway, we've got 372 sites, which is covering 338,000 kilometers squared. And I did the metrics. I think the land area of the UK is only 250,000 square kilometers. So we have a greater area of sea protected ostensibly than we do of the land area. It's under different forms of legislation. We still have a hangover of being part of the EU. We have EU legislation at EU marine protected areas and domestic marine protected areas. In fact, we have more EU marine protected areas than we have domestic marine protected areas. We have something like 150 marine protected areas under domestic laws, and the rest is pretty much under EU laws. They're designated and managed for the conservation, both maintain or recover the conservation of those features. And that is a failing of the marine protected area mechanism. Most of the papers you'll read about marine protected area science suggest that the highest levels of protection and protection of the entirety of the ecosystems within the boundaries of the marine protected areas provide greater benefits. And the regulations to protect them are put in place by authorities after they receive advice from statutory nature conservation bodies on the vulnerability of the features in those marine protected areas to all variety of human activities, from bait collection inshore to offshore oil and gas and wind farm developments, to trawling and other forms of fishing activity. And what concerns me is in the law, there is no real consideration of wider ecosystem services or measures for the recovery of entire ecosystems as they may benefit society. They might be implied and they might be alluded to in things called impact assessments when their bylaws are put in place to protect them. But you go back to each one of the bylaws, I believe, and you see that they are weakened by the fact that the features, both physical and biological features of the sites are the things which drive the conservation objectives and the measures associated with the site. And I think that is a very stark failing of these sites. And is very much prone to political will. And this is these next 2 points. The governments of the day do not like bylaws. They prefer to have voluntary approaches to MPAs. Bylaws are made necessary when there is a statutory concern that the duty of the Secretary of State to protect those sites cannot be played out by voluntary measures. Nevertheless, when a bylaw is introduced, it implies cost, and the Treasury has to provide budget and allocate budget for the management of the site. And would you believe that means that local politics, and I would suggest a Conservative government, perhaps more than a Labour government, would be less inclined to see bylaws in place and would rather see other mechanisms. So politics comes into this, and the politics isn't just the national politics, the Treasury influencing DEFRA and what it might want to achieve by these sites. There's also local politics. So, for example, if there's a very powerful fishing lobby in a port, even though that might be representing less than 50 people, that still becomes a bigger player politically than perhaps the thousands that will benefit from a more enhanced marine ecosystem. And then latterly, over the last year or so, there's been quite good press coverage over highly protected marine areas, but the government's only considering a pilot number of sites. 5, indeed, will be designated by the end of next year, according to government targets, after a very costly review that travelled around the UK. So I don't think the investment in highly protected marine areas at the moment is worth the benefit that we could derive from seeing a network of highly protected marine areas. Keith and I know very well that the Secretary of State had in front of him a decade ago about 65 so-called reference areas that he could have designated then, but he didn't do it then. Why are we likely to get it now? We just don't know. This is about political will and proper accounting of evidence of things like ecosystem services, as opposed to small local political decisions. So I'm not very encouraged about the HPMA debate, I'm afraid, at the moment. Now, ecosystem services of sites is a fascinating thing that is becoming more in the vernacular of conservationists and accounting for these ecosystem services. There are provisioning services, which are basically the resources the marine environment gives me, or any environment, be it land or fresh water. So things like fish, fisheries, seaweed, genetic resources. And then there are supporting services, I say, keeping us healthy, the parts of the ecosystem that keep both us and wildlife healthy and functioning. And there are maintaining services, those services that kind of protect us from damaging activities like climate change, or damaging things like climate change, or toxification of waterways by poor water quality. Biodiversity can actually protect us and buffer us against these things if it's rich. Also, sediments are stabilized by biodiversity and seagrass beds, for example. So those parts of the services that ecosystems provide will protect us. And cultural, another way of looking at this, might be keeping us content or happy, keeping us actually healthy as well, because psychologically there's been great studies that being by the sea and being outdoors, of course, reduces the concerns of mental health to society. And of course, it's been vital to keep us all happy during the lockdown situation. So these ecosystem services are vital for accounting for the benefits from the seas, and they aren't properly accounted. In fact, let's go back to the regulations again. They protect species and habitats. But as I look at it, if you protect the species and habitats in their entirety, which has been what my job has been for 10 years, to try to convince authorities to do this, you get the whole circle dealt with. So we need to change our vernacular on how we think about marine protected areas and parts of the seas that we want to protect. The biodiversity enhances all these functions, but only if we protect comprehensively these ecosystems. So next slide. Okay, so let's go back a bit to my work on trying to make these marine protected areas function more effectively for society. About 10 to 20 odd years ago, there were starting to be individual successes of non-government organisations versus the governments of Scotland, particularly, and England, but also in Wales, using EU laws, particularly over damaging fishing activities in marine protected areas. But individual successes are very, very time consuming and costly, and only have site-specific results. So MCS and Client Earth did a legal campaign from about 2009 to 2012 to force the MMO's hand, the marine management organization that is, who had the authority to grant fishing licenses. I'm dealing with only fishing in this part of the talk, really, because fishing was the greatest outlier in being managed at this time. And we wanted to force their hand to be systemic in their protection of the seabed from these damaging activities in all current, at that time, marine protected areas. And we were successful in that DEFRA published and delivered a revised approach to the management of fisheries in 2012 that resulted in full application of the laws in local regulations for all by all fisheries regulators or all MPAs from starting in 2013. At the time, what was really exciting about my job is not only had we had the success of the change on paper and a published review and DEFRA getting all the regulators into a room, there was a very exciting tour of the country. Now, I like gigs and going to see bands and they tour the country. This is probably the best gig I ever saw. It was by a guy called David Tildersley, who was an expert on habitats regulations assessments. And he gave the same sort of talk he'd been doing for Natural England for decades to terrestrial regulators, if you like. Finally, he did it to fisheries regulators. And you could hear a pin drop in the room when this guy was speaking very, very clearly about what had to be done. So that was a very, very satisfying time of my career. And then eventually, what was already in the back pocket, if you like, of one of the more forward-thinking regulators who anticipated an NGO taking a case to UK government. He said he already had a sense of an approach that should use a risk-based approach. And that risk-based approach essentially allowed regulators to do this in triages or tranches. And so initially the action was for red risk features, the high risk features like biogenic reef and seagrass beds to be protected initially. And then by 2017 for the amber risk, the lower risk features such as sandbanks and the biological communities associated with those to be protected laterally. So we dealt with the most damaging activities in all the sites first. But sadly, it's being played out slowly by different regulators, and different regulators have different ideas. There's been sort of political will and drift, you might say. The regulators might feel slightly less put upon by DEFRA, that partly their paymasters and their bosses, so to speak. So it's been a slightly different approach in the last few years, which is and has been possibly been diluted by the seriousness of the Brexit issues, both related to MPAs, but also to obviously quota. The test cases I alluded to that happened initially, here's two examples. One in Falmouth, that I was working with a local marine biologist called Dr. Miles Hoskin, and we published a paper with Tom Appleby from the Blue Marine Foundation. So that paper is kind of like to me in England, although similar work had already been done in Northern Ireland and Scotland, it's a seminal paper to say what the law should be and how it should be played out locally. So we thought we should write that down. But also what was happening on the right of the slide is this concern that once you'd had the dredgers through in a site like in Strangford Lough, how on earth was the biological community going to recover? But thankfully, I saw a talk by Joe Breen, a local government regulator, government advisor, and he said things have finally come back, but it took about 15 to 20 years for the Modiolus beds of Strangford Lough to recover. And that was with human intervention and enhancement. So the thing that is very sad about marine conservation is often the damage is done before you get the action in place to stop any further damage. It takes a long time to recover in UK marine waters. It takes just a short time to completely obliterate benthic communities, as Keith will tell you about. This is the risk matrix. That's the entirety of it. You can't read it. Don't worry, I'll go into it a little bit of detail. On the y-axis, in effect, on the rows on the left here are all the fishing gears, and on the x-axis, the title of the columns are all the benthic habitats. So if we look at a particular section of the red of the matrix where there are some reds and ambers, you can see for towed demersal gears by beam trawl, there's no allowance within this risk matrix approach for seagrass or merle to be approached or towed over by the gear. So that's this document, this Excel spreadsheet was replicated for every single one of the inshore marine protected areas by your local regulator, the Devon and Severn Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority. I went to their offices soon after this was a new approach, and they had an enormous printed out spreadsheet for each one of their 6 or 7 marine protected areas, however many there are under EU regulations. So it was it led to a huge amount of work for these regulators to assess fishing and then provide the local regulations to protect the fisheries. But it's not enough. The only sites that have bottom-towed gear fishing bans within the network of European marine sites are the ones in blue. The ones in blue, like the Northumberland site up here where my cursor is, the inshore waters of the north of the southern Yorkshire coast, around the Cromer chalk beds, some areas of the Wash, a few areas around Essex estuaries, and particularly around the reef habitats of the southwest. Those have been protected by bylaw from bottom-towed fishing gear in their entirety. But many of the offshore sites, well, all of the offshore sites really, apart from just a tiny pinprick of a site off here, off Margate and Long Sands Marine Protected Area, they have not received protection yet, because before we left the EU, we had to go through a very complex process, which was described by the Common Fisheries Policy to exclude fishing activities by all member states' vessels. And we had to essentially get agreement from every single member state's fishing fishing management civil services, and that just was impractical, impossible, and politically far too complicated. So since Brexit, we've had promises from DEFRA that we will get this dealt with. And remember, these are just the special areas of conservation under EU laws. There's a whole plethora of domestic legislation sites as well that will be apparently dealt with by 2025 by the Secretary of State. So the opportunity is there, but will we grasp the nettle? Here is, actually, I forgot to put this slide in. Here's some indication of the fishing pressure that takes place in our offshore sites. This is from just 1 year in 2015. And one of the sites that we've been most active in trying to consider protection for is the Dogger Bank. We provided a report of what we believe to be the right sort of approach to managing the site, and we sent that to DEFRA. And there are currently proposals that might be reported on for the site to be entirely closed to all forms of bottom-towed fishing gear in the next couple of weeks. So watch the media, because it will be a big day for conservation, because that site is bigger than any of the sites currently protecting from bottom-towed fishing gear in the entire rest of the UK. And it would be the first offshore site of any significant scale that would exclude this activity, which is predominantly fished by overseas fleets. The Danes, the Spanish, the French, and the Germans are fishing in a greater UK vessels as we know it. These data are from AIS information that we've published at the beginning of this year. So there is an opportunity for our MPAs to be well managed. Enforcement is another thing, as we have talked about before this talk, Mike and I. That is possibly another issue for another day for another conservationist. These things take so long. The climate emergency and biodiversity emergency are not being considered seriously by governments. So these things take almost generational timescales, sadly. But let's go to the local stuff. Now, that's the background of MPAs, if you like. This is an exciting opportunity we got on the back of the revised approach. When this David Tildersley workshop, as I said, the best gig in town, visited Brixham, I had a word with one of the local scientists who was there. He's on this photo, he's here, he's called Colin Trundle. He's the chief scientist of the Cornwall Inshore and Fisheries and Conservation Authority. Talking to him, he said, right, we've got this site called the Eddystone. Maybe we need to do some survey work within the closed area to see whether it's actually succeeding as an MPA. So with funding from the Pigshed Trust and then latterly Princess Yachts, we got money for this chap called Stephen Pikesley from University of Exeter, who works with Matt Witt, who's interested in ocean ecology as well, to undertake photographic analysis of drop-down photos taken in 3 boxes, a closed area box, a near control and a far control. Using this vessel called Tiger Lily, dropping a camera with high resolution stills down on the seabed. I was lucky enough to join the vessel a couple of years ago before lockdown. It's a fantastic vessel for doing the work. The camera was dropped over the side of the vessel with this winch with an umbilical cord, which was allowed the Colin to actually take an image whenever the camera dropped on the seabed. It was risen and then dropped on average every minute thereafter, as in a direction that was completely at the whims of weather and tide. we found that if we wanted to drop the camera in exactly the same locations, it was almost impossible. So our controls, in effect, within the boxes were the sediment habitat type that we were on, and also by looking at side scan sonar imagery of the proximity to reef areas. So we were able to a certain extent to control in our analysis of the subsequent imagery where we understood the ecology of the photo being taken. Colin was right next to this. He would have been just on the left of that image. And there he was looking at a monitor to look at what the camera, the GoPro camera, was telling him about when the whole array was dropped onto the seabed, at which point he on a walkie-talkie would talk through into the wheelhouse and say, go to this lady who worked to capture the images. And then each tow would be something like 20 to 30 images within each box. And then within each year, we got about 400 images. So about, I think on average, about 5 or 6 tows per box per year was about what was undertaken. And I could go into this detail a bit more with Keith over lots and lots of cups of coffee another time, but essentially the species differences associated with the boxes further away from the area that was controlled from bottom tow fishing gear had more scavengers and mobile species, which were in the lower data. You can see crab, hermit crab, and anemone, and the difference between box 1 and box 3, box 1 being the box in the closed area, and box 3 the furthest one away. And the data explains that the more sessile upright life forms are more numerous inside the area that is closed to bottom-towed fishing gear. Now, unfortunately, the data didn't show any time series effect, so effect of like the reserve being set up and then time sequentially allowing the organisms to grow on the seabed. That is unfortunate. And maybe we needed to do greater data collection, and will do for many, many more years to elucidate any sort of temporal patterns in the data. But spatially, it was definitely the conclusion that there were more benthic upright life forms growing on the seabed, such as these bryozoans, soft coral sponges. They were more prevalent on the seabed in the areas close to bottom-towed fishing gear. So that suggests to me, as an ecologist, understanding some of the reading associated with these organisms, that the ecosystem services of these areas will in time, in due course, be more beneficial to mankind from some of the literature we're reading. We just published the paper that came out in Marine Policy last week on the biological results of the work. We also, just as importantly, I think, presented or produced a paper last year in Aquatic Conservation on the governance aspects of the whole story, which is kind of what I've talked about up to now, which is really about the background to the IFICAs, how they're constituted, how they work, which is of great interest to our European cousins who would love to have a similar body representing conservation and fishing equitably in their seas, not only actually in Europe, but also in Scotland, where there is no such body as the IFICAs. So they're not perfect. Some are better than others, but they are pretty good model for democratic governance of certain aspects of marine management, I think. Keith's aware of this. We produced a chapter in a book about whole site protection rather than feature-based protection, which we think is needed for effective ecosystem recovery. Our MPAs at the moment generally are really poor in terms of providing maximal benefit to the marine ecosystem. They don't even rank on IUCN criteria, which suggests that the entire water column as well as the seabed should be managed. So that immediately negates the ability for any of the sites to be properly assessed in IUCN ranking criteria. And also we found that reefs are protected while sand and muddy sites receive little protection in UK seas, be that in the southwest or more so perhaps in the east, where there's more bottom-towed fishing gear activities of variety of gears closer to coast. In the southwest, it tends to be more otter trawling and definitely scallop dredging. So you can read that book chapter. It's on the left in the box here, the Solandt et al. Paper here. That's in a wider book that was really quite readable about MPA, the benefits and the realities of MPAs and their management. So the Eddystone conclusions are simply that life exists in sediments. Maybe we should, even though the site was protected for the reefs, we've seen from studies in Lyme Bay, and this is a small version of that study over many more years in Lyme Bay, which has been going on for about 13 years now, I think, that life does exist in sediments. Hey, and maybe we should protect something other than the reefs. And the more complex forms of life grow away from where trawling is apparent. So the scavengers that I was alluding to earlier in the further boxes are able to be mobile, and they feed on pretty much, one might suggest, the dead organisms that are killed by trawling or damaged organisms. And very few MPAs are protected from trawling. We think about 5% of our MPAs are protected from trawling. Regulators are relatively unambitious as a whole, and they are very scared about the law and being judicially reviewed. So they will do de minimis protection, perhaps, unless NGOs become coalesced and work hard to pressure governments, as we did in 2012. And I think we've been quite good at with the Blue Marine Foundation and Greenpeace and Client Earth with that report about Dogger Bank over the offshore site issues. But because we understand from Client Earth and other similar bodies that the current laws we have do allow for proper protection in many cases that go beyond features. That's a conversation for another day at a greater level of detail. And another area of work that we've done, other than the Eddystone and that wider implication of the whole site approach and protecting beyond features, is this more local work we're starting to do under a project called Remedies, which is a Natural England-led project, whereby we're trying to reduce the impact on seagrass beds and other associated ecosystems in 5 South Coast English marine protected areas. So the traditional block and chain moorings create an abrasion impact on the seabed. In some of these aerial images from around the United Kingdom, you can see the halos created by the chains as at low water and with some considerable wind, the boats or the mooring buoys themselves are moved around in a circular dimension, and that creates this halo effect. So obviously we need to try and reduce the footprint of this in such an important carbon-rich biodiversity and sediment stabilizing habitat. And one of the pieces of work that I got quite interested in was done by the Ocean Conservation Trust in about 2016 by a bloke called Mark Parry, who's a local boy. He's a Plymouth, I think he's Plymouth lad, I think. And he thought a very simple technique, which is to rise the chain off the seabed. And there's a further addition to the possible technology, which is not just to use a block, it's actually to pile a screw into the seabed. So the devices that we have had funding for in Cawsand have screwed this monopile into the seabed and raised the riser chain with the submerged buoys. Very simple technology, apart from the screw pile, which is quite a complicated thing to get in the seabed. Screw piles are bigger than you think. We've overspec'd the entire project for yachts of about 5 meters, or fishing boats or yachts which are way under 10 meters. But you've got to overspec things to make stakeholders understand that they're going to mechanically work. So the contractor we eventually used is a guy who's working on the wider Remedies project, but he screwed 2 of these into the seabed, one on top of the other. So you basically have 4 meters of screw pile under the water with a very heavy chain on it. You can see a demonstration of that chain in the top left, which is what they had in the National Marine Aquarium Atlantic tank, or the Eddystone tank, I think it's called, for a number of years. Mark was very good at collaborating with the Queen's Harbour Master, this bloke called, I can't remember his name, but he represented the Rame Gig Club. He found 5 volunteers, and in May 2019, 5 moorings were installed to the specifications that we've seen in the previous slide. And then we started monitoring them. And we did monitoring trips for local divers. We did about 5 visits with 6 to 12 divers per trip. I don't know why I said 6 to 12. We never seemed to get more than about 6. Hard boats were used, and we were counting shoot density and shoot length in a radial design away from the mooring itself, to try and sense the impact of seagrass and how it might change away from the footprint of the mooring itself. And we measured density, so the amount of shoot, not the amount of blades, but the amount of shoots that are coming off the substrate. Here's a shoot in the right-hand image. These are blades, maybe 4 or 5 come from each individual shoot. So we've measured the shoots in terms of density, and then we measure up to about 10 or 12 randomly selected blades to get an estimate of length. And the data have just been collected for dives that take place in August. And this is the quarter-meter quadrat that we used, placed at these distances from the center of the pin. So if the pin or the mooring block is in the center, you would swim with your divers out on a northwest compass bearing, drop your quadrat at 0.5 meters, 5 meters, 9 meters. We calculated that the zone of influence of the mooring chain would maximally be about 6 to 7 meters historically from the tide and the length of chain that was used before. And 9 meters could be used as kind of a control, as it was outside the zone of influence, but also very, very close to the location of the work from where the mooring was. So that was our experimental design, to look at inside the zone of influence versus outside the zone of influence. And just about after 2 years, we're seeing a very small, but I don't think it's going to be significant if we were to do statistics on this because of the variability in the data. But it's a small increase in the number of shoots within the zone of influence, which is the 0.5 meter and 5 meter line. So here, within these areas, there was the mean increase in 0.1 and 1.4 shoots per quadrat, which was about an 8% increase in number of shoots within the zone of influence within the 2 years. In the control area, if you like, I mean, it's not going to be statistically significant because of the variance in the data. We saw a decline in the number of shoots per quarter-meter quadrat. So small increase at 0.5, a larger increase at 5 meters, and at 9 meters, there was a smallish decrease. We think we're studying in a location which is where we're right on the edge of the seagrass. And also, as Mark has suggested, the 2 moorings where there's been significant declines are the ones that are closer to the coast, to the actual shoreline, where the ferry comes in, the Cawsand ferry. So he thinks that possibly there's a factor related to greater human activity in the shallower areas. And also, it doesn't seem to be a primary seagrass habitat. I think we're just on the edge of its ability to survive well in shallowish waters. Or, yeah, it is just a very, very busy bay. You know it. It can be up to 120 boats in that location in the summer months. And a couple of the dives we did, it was very, very busy. Interesting, the shoot length. This is the mean increase in shoot length in the 0.5, 5 meter, 9 meter locations, all went up by 12, 12 and 14 centimeters, which was about a 30 to 40% increase in shoot length. So whilst we might see much more variable data in terms of the density of the beds, we did see a much more considerable increase in shoot length. I can't explain that data because this has recently been analysed just by me, and we want to use Plymouth University students to work it up properly. There could be a number of explanations that are in the literature which allow us to see that. Oops, that was wrong. I've only got one more slide, I think. Okay, so seagrass, in conclusion, seems to be more dense in the zone of influence since we put these riser buoys on the riser chain. Seagrass has increased in length, in blade length everywhere. And most importantly, and we just did a film of all the volunteers, equally importantly, it seems that the mechanical strength of the devices has been proven. Now, this is really important for the wider Remedies project and for the success of collaborations going forwards. You have to show the stakeholders that the engineering works as much as the ecological reasons for the work. So that's it. I just gave a massive overview of UK MPAs and then some of the science that can be enabled, as I see it, when you get the first measures in place. We would have never got the funding from both Princess Yachts and the Pigshed Trust if we hadn't had the regulations in place. And this is something governments fail perhaps to have vision about, is that I think we have a part of society that is willing to invest in our marine protected areas were they to be properly regulated. Without regulation and without any sort of sense of backing that these places are at least meant to be protected from the most damaging activities, why would anyone invest in them? Why are they going to provide returns on blue carbon? Why are they going to provide returns on essential fish habitat? So what happened in 2012, I think, was an opportunity to go, we can really move forward on this. And the seagrass work is sort of another adjunct to that. We're pretty pleased with the seagrass work as well. So I'm going to stop there and be delighted to take any questions.
Yes, fantastic talk to say the least. Very detailed there, Jean. Thanks very much.